Good morning, everybody. Hope you all are doing well today. First and foremost, want to get a few things started by mentioning some odds and ends that I've gotten through email and through the discussion board on course. First and foremost, try to be patient as much as you can with the book rental system. I know that it's going to be very difficult for the bookstore to kind of get things moving in this case. But at the same time, if it isn't coming in the speed that you need it to, I will make sure to look to accommodate for y'all, as in many ways that I can, to make sure that we're all on the same page and going through the text appropriately. Um, However, I am going a little bit. I want to go into these particular topics in a way that is explaining them in a way that makes sense based on how we're kind of structuring the class together. So I've got a syllabi that I want to run by, but I also want to be able to talk about the things that you're interested in and how you communicate on the message board. So make sure that you are being very articulate and very thorough in terms of what you want out of this class through the message boards and the forums, because that kind of helps me structure things. And to go along with that, I was kind of trying to decide how I wanted to do this particular lecture within Persuasion and advertising ethics. And one of the things that came up was there were a lot of different areas that people were interested in advertising ethics. People were interested in governing bodies like the Federal Trade Communication or Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communication Commission. Um, Self-regulation, that kind of thing. So very much law oriented and regulation based. So that's really, really good. And we will be covering over that. Other people were like, look, I'm going to the job market in about a month. So I really need to be talking about that. Also really good. So let's talk about that. The other thing I want to mention, and it's going to be the focus of what I talk about today, was this ideology of how advertisers utilize persuasion. And I think this is an interesting facet that we need to be talking about. And I'm going to be running through this as we go. But um, this is a major notion of what is persuasion, because I saw a lot of comments that had this underlying current. They didn't actually outright say it, but it had this underlying current of how advertisers manipulate. Um, and not so much in the same sense, but I have heard a lot of people say how advertisers uses coercion, um, which in a mass media message, coercion is hard to do. But it does get into some of the stereotypes about advertising, and it also gets into some of the stereotypes about ethics with advertising. Because mainly when I talk to people about this, I'll come in and say something like, "Oh, I'm teaching an advertising ethics class," and I get this very hoity, "Oh, isn't that an oxymoron?" But I think there's a big misconception about not only what advertising is, but what persuasion is in general. When we get into advertising for that fact, it is paid, it is persuasive, and it is mass communicated. So those are the three very strong facets of what makes advertising, and that actually is going to hit home when we start talking about Federal Trade Commissions, or FTC, as I'm going to continue calling regulations, with influencer marketing. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you see here in the slide that I've got up here about persuasion, manipulation, and coercion. Are these concepts similar or are they different? So let's talk about them. So persuasion defined is a successful intentional effort at influencing another's mental state through communication in the circumstance in which the persuadee has some measure of freedom. That's one. Another one that I thought was really interesting is persuasion is a symbolic process, which the communicator tries to convince other people to change their attitudes or behaviors in regarding an issue through the transmission of a message in an atmosphere of free choice. Okay. Now, if you're reading through these, you might want to sit here and take a second about what are some common themes here? What are some common themes that we see within persuasion and these definitions? So, um, two things that I can kind of get right off the bat. One is fairly obvious, is the idea of, as you see here, the word influence and the word convince have very strong processes about how we use our communication. But you'll also notice in these two definitions, measure of freedom, atmosphere of free choice. Okay, dissecting these sentences comes into a major facet about why we differentiate persuasion versus things like coercion or manipulation. So these aren't interchangeable words. So if you're using them interchangeably, by definition, it really is you can, because the main reason is when we look at manipulation and coercion, it loses the one thing that makes persuasion what it is, and that is an application of freedom. This is a freedom to eventually choose whether or not you listen to the message or whether or not you take the person's advice. So that's really important. Manipulation, you're being fooled into that. Now, is it to say that advertisers use manipulation to do some of the things? Yes, absolutely. That happens. But in a lot of cases, if you really start dissecting advertising, and whether it be television scripts or whether it be advertising that you find online through like pop-up ads, you'll see that a lot of them are actually just persuading. They're not saying that you have to do something. They're not saying that they're trying to fool you. They're honestly saying, hey, look, this is something that we have. We think it might interest you. You know, if it's in your best interest, go out and buy it. That's actually one of my favorite instances. In fact, I'm going to pull it up right now. Sorry, I'm being a little silent right now. I wanted to talk about this, of how we use this. And you might look at this in terms of a manipulation, but we as colleagues have talked about this quite a bit. Oh boy. Pull it up. Come on now. All right, well, I'll just do this real quick. It's this idea of Patagonia that had this advertising saying, and I'm not joking when I show you this. I mean, it's all over here in the Google results. Don't buy this jacket. And they're talking about the aspect of carbon footprinting. Um, Basically, if you have need for this jacket, then buy it. If you don't need use of this jacket and you're just trying to get it to look cool and so forth, then don't. Which was kind of their uh, idea for marketing. Now, you could say, well, that's manipulation because they're trying to fool you into making it seem like there's choice. And so manipulation does come into that, where they would say something to the effect of, it is the illusion of choice, where you think you have it, but when in actuality you don't. But at the same time, you do have a choice because you can choose to ignore this ad completely or not buy it at all. So there's that. So we get into a little bit of manipulation and persuasion and coercion. Coercion would be, in this case, you were forced to do it in one matter, whether it be a threat, whether it be taking away from something. These are all facets where coercion would be, I'm going to do something negative to you if you don't do something. So that's not a choice. I mean, for a lot of it, the thing that's going through my brain, I'm like, that's blackmail. And we're not trying to get people to blackmail somebody to buy something, with at least within advertising messaging. So these are the things that I wanted to mention right off the bat in terms of persuasion. So let's look at some of these things real quick here. So see here, sorry, I'm drinking my coffee a little bit. We see a couple things here with persuasion in terms of how we deal with behavioral intentions. Because remember, part of this is I might have an ideology of I intend to do something, but whether or not I actually go through with it is another thing. So this is actually kind of a cool thing with one of my favorite authors that talks about persuasion. His name is Robert Cialdini. Robert Cialdini had a kind of a cool idea. He was an academic, but he wanted to know, why do people get persuaded? when somebody gives a message. So he gave a very astute example of I'm just sitting at my door, and all of a sudden there's these three Girl Scouts that come by selling cookies. And he's like, I don't want Thin Mints. I don't want cebollas. I don't want shortbread. Part of me is like, well, why wouldn't you? I mean, they're Girl Scout cookies, and Girl Scout cookies are delicious. However, um, this was the kind of thing where he would sit there and go, why I don't want these things. Why am I buying them? And that's what happened. He ends up in his story buying these Girl Scout cookies. So when we get into a little bit of understanding theory of reason action, behavioral intention, he didn't have the intention to do something. However, his behavior said otherwise because he actually ended up buying the cookies that were being sold. So that's weird, right? What is it about this notion of uh, your intentions versus your behavior to do something? And so this is where persuasion comes in. So we see things like attitudes and subjective norms. Now, attitudes are my feelings towards something. So there are a lot of different variables that could come in with the example of Girl Scout cookies. One being, I have a strong attitude towards Girl Scout cookies because um, granted, I'm like the most boring Girl Scout cookie person on the face of the earth. I like shortbread cookies, so I'm also the person that likes oatmeal raisin. Uh, Please don't come after me too bad on that. I actually think that they're really delicious when they're made right. But I know a lot of people would say, "Oh my gosh, you like eating cardboard." Um, but I have a strong attitude towards them, and I really like them. So if I ever see a certain type of cookie, I'll sit there and go, "Hey, it is my behavioral intention to eat them because they look really really good." Here's okay. This is where it gets kind of interesting, though. I get really excited because this is where we talk a lot about normative behavior in society and the people that influence us. So it's an ongoing meme culture that it is a subjective norm within our culture's standpoint, as well as um, the friends that I have that oatmeal cookies are gross and I shouldn't eat them. So I have a constant battle. It's like a cognitive dissonance, if you will, between my attitudes and my subjective norms, cultural norms, and friendships around me, to where I would say, I like oatmeal raisin cookies. They're actually really damn good. However, I've got this group of people telling me, no, they're garbage, don't eat them. And so I have this like moral conundrum about what I actually like versus what I'm actually told that I'm like. And you got to think about this for a second. Does that influence anything that you do or buy? Is you might sit there and say this product is crap. However, I know that a lot of people like it, and I know that a lot of people would influence me to say that this is a good product. Ergo, I still have a positive opinion about it, and I might still play it, which is ludicrous. It's ludicrous to think that just because of a friend's intentions to tell you something, despite your attitude, that you would go on with a behavioral intention and a behavior. Now, some of those are good. Some of them is anytime I go out to exercise, I don't like to go out to exercise when I first start. However, I know it is within a subjective norm to try to stay healthy. I know a lot of friends that are working hard to work out as much as they can. So my behavioral intention changes and I change my behavior. And I reluctantly go on runs as much as I can every morning. So let's keep going with this. Now, there are some different variables that come into there. First and foremost is this idea of perceived behavioral control, is whether or not you think you can do something. So it's like the physical capabilities of being able to do something, or or are you just that tired that you're like, I can't do it. It's within it's without the bounds of my control, so I don't do something. So there's that, and there's also what's listed that it's not in this model, but it's put up here, which is past behavior, which links to behavioral attitudes, and it links into intentions. That basically says, I've done it in the past. What did I think about it? So, for instance, I like skiing. I have good memories about skiing. But there are a lot of people that I know that got really seriously injured when they were skiing. So they had to have a big conversation with themselves through past intention or excuse me, past attitudes, where they say, in my past attitude I broke my leg when I was skiing. And I know a lot of people that had that as a ski racer. So their behavioral attitude is, I still love skiing even though this happened. And then my intention to do something versus my behavior to eventually engage in it, which a lot of people ended up going skiing afterwards because they were like, I enjoyed so much that this injury won't stop me, which is a major form of what we're doing here. So, what does that have to do with a lot of this? Part of it has to do with how we process information. There is a really good theory that talks about this. It's called the elaboration likelihood model, in terms of how we process information. Now, it is to say that there are some logical fallacies with this model, and I think it's important to discuss this. And I don't want to say it's through fallacy. It's just there are certain things that we find that are really important to how we weigh factual information versus how we weigh some of the smaller idiosyncrasies of commercials, that we might be persuaded of something. So it basically means that our brain can't be on all the time. Sometimes we don't put in all the processing it takes to be able to purchase something in a means that I used all my logic for it. I did all my homework for it. In fact, it was one of the first things that Robert Cialdini mentioned in his book was this idea of he called it click word. That it was he was calling it through fixed action patterns. This basically had something to do with this idea of when somebody tells you something, it's automatically your instinct to do this. Click were. And he told a story about how he was talking to a woman who was selling jewelry. And it was this turquoise jewelry, if memory serves correctly. And she was like, they were not going off the shelves. They were remaining stagnant. They'd always stay there. Nobody wanted to buy it. And so he's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So what did you do? And she goes, well, I did kind of conventional wisdom, which is I marked it half off. And it's like, cool. How did that work? And she said something to the effect of, it didn't work. In fact, nobody came to buy it. I was still remaining stagnant. And he's like, well, that's kind of weird. You know, you'd think that lowering the price would be something that we would sit there and say, hey, this is a great deal. So it wasn't until they went back up to regular price and she tried to do conventional wisdom again, which is market half off again. But over the phone, she told one of her associates half off, but apparently the associate heard it as double the price. So let's say that this turquoise jewelry is at $100. Now she's saying, I want it at $200. What happens is they fly off the shelves. They're gone. They're sold out. Why? Why is this the case that we do this? This is a very peripheral route ideology. This also goes the same if you go to a grocery store. So if you go to a grocery store, especially in the produce aisle, this happens a lot. You might sit there and say, okay, there are. I wish there were people here so I could just be like, what are some good vegetables that you would say? So I like broccoli. I'm going to use broccoli. You see a bunch of broccoli that's sitting on a shelf. They look really enticing. They look really good to eat, and you want to carry a bunch of them home because there's a ton of them. It is a it's not even a secret anymore, really, that grocers try to overstock, mainly because when there's a lot of something, it looks more enticing that way. Whereas if there was only one thing of broccoli, if there's only one head of broccoli that is sitting here in the produce aisle, I might sit there and say, something's wrong with that broccoli. If it was only one. Now, if there were 20 of them, I would say, hey, I'm going to pick the best one. And there obviously are ones that I would really enjoy. There might be nothing wrong with that poor little solo broccoli that's sitting there. I hope y'all don't watch this at noon. I'm gonna make y'all really hungry. Of course, I'm talking about oatmeal raisin cookies and broccoli, so I might not make you that hungry. Uh, so, but again, we see this within this peripheral route. Light, sound setting, secondary arguments. This may even have to do with like jingles of so forth. There is something to be said about earworms, as they call them, getting stuck into your brain. Of if you ever have a song stuck in your head for hours and hours upon end. Um, One example that I love is from the movie Inside Out. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, um, but there's a poor bus driver that is trying to find his happy place, and all of a sudden a memory plays of this commercial. It's triple mint gum, um, and they go through this song, but it's super interesting because the way the movie portrays it is this again kind of click word is they add this little memory into this poor bus driver's brain that it's hey it's that annoying jingle that's so catchy that it gets caught inside your brain. Now this may not make it so that you buy something. Peripheral route in this case doesn't mean that you're going to buy something, but it is something that kind of keeps in your head this entire time. And especially, so some of y'all have mentioned about unintentional audiences or audiences that are uninterested. I might not have any interest in gum, for instance. I might not care, but I might see something like I like Five Gum commercials. I don't even know if Five Gum still exists, but I like Five Gum commercials when they were out because they like went way out of their way to create a sensation. So as an advertising scholar, it was something that I was immediately hooked to. But we saw this in. I might look at it as a line of gum, and I'm like, I don't really care which one it is. It's gum. I I don't have a major opinion about gum. Now, I'm probably going to get a bunch of comments in the forums that are like, "Well, I'm going to tell you about this particular gum. I'm an Orbit person, so you back off." Uh, but this is the kind of thing where we get into this peripheral route and understanding a little bit of sometimes these jingles work, and sometimes like having a celebrity influencer, regardless of how much they know about the product, are persuasive. And then there's the central route, which is very much doing your research, very much doing your homework, picking out the logical arguments, what's logical, what's not. This happens a lot. Well, actually, it doesn't happen a lot. It should happen a lot within political campaigns about how we feel about a person. Most time within political campaigns, our minds are already made up before it even starts. But there is something to be said for what products that we use for logical arguments. And one thing that I think about when I think of logical arguments is how much do we think about high end products that are going to last us for decades. So like a car, for instance, we've got to make sure that this is not a hasty decision. Now I know people that buy cars hastily and don't do a lot of research, but for me, at least, because I can't afford a car every day, um, I sit there and say, well, I want this car. I need this car. However, the means to buy it needs to be a worthwhile investment for where I live. What's the surrounding area around me? What is the thing that I need it to do the most? For intents and purposes, it's my wife and I. Melissa and I are. We don't need that much space for a car, so but we do need to get up a mountain every now and again. So we have to think about these things about what is the best central route processing here. But it does get a little interesting when we get into some of the ethics about how we emphasize peripheral route and central route when it comes to products that normally would be peripheral route processing, but actually are not. So there was a really cool study that talked about this, and this is where I would say there was a fallacy within this model. And again, it's not so much a fallacy per se, it's more along the lines of, hey, this is something that it doesn't have the same external validity, which means replication of this study was a little hard to find because we use this other product and we're not getting the same result. So, what we see here is this idea that, like makeup, for instance, we might see a L'Oreal commercial, we might see a Revlon commercial where somebody is putting on makeup and normally would say, hey, an attractive person or perceivably attractive person uh, would be part of the peripheral. Or saying, hey, this person to whoever the audience is perceivably attractive. And it is gone through a lot of different research protocols that said if a person is perceivably attractive, they're automatically, at least for a short term period, more credible. Now, whether or not that's actually something that lasts or something that's um, right, it's not. Um, but it is something that people do quite a lot. Is if a person is attractive to them, they are going to find them more trustworthy initially. But within this peripheral route, if you look at makeup commercials, you might sit there and say that's actually pretty darn central. Is the way this person looks. If they're putting on makeup and they look really good, perceivably really good, uh, it might be that this is actually a central route processing because I'm weighing all the options to say, hey, this model looks really good with this makeup. And so, therefore, um, I think this product would really work. So, these are all variables to consider with ELM. It is very important to talk about in terms of how we process things and how we utilize things. I am not going to get into some of these areas within the debates, but I will talk a little bit. Actually, that one was kind of interesting. Talking about the Nixon and John F. Kennedy debates. Um, this is a very old example, but at the same time, showed that Nixon, who was going through the campaign trail, was tired. He'd been going through campaigning trails all across the United States, and he looked like he didn't look that good on TV, whereas John F. Kennedy looked great. And a lot of people thought that John F. Kennedy won the debate, not necessarily because he was attractive, but this was the kind of thing that John F. Kennedy looked more clear and composed. And we'll talk more about this. I honestly, in many cases, don't think that a lot of the debates are that too much important because most people have made up their mind by the time that they happen. So these little idiosyncrasies don't really matter too much, but they are something that are very important in terms of discussion about how people are influenced them. So I'm going to hold off on a little bit of the six weapons here, but I do want to talk about them real quickly here of the six universal principles of persuasion um, and how they work, and we're going to talk about them on Monday because I don't want to let this go. The key facet of where we get into ethics, especially with persuasion, is this notion that persuasion does give this idea of freedom of choice, that you don't have to buy something if you don't want to. You don't have to pay attention to something if you don't want to. Um, the important thing to consider is when we're talking about advertising, when we're talking about strategic communication, how do we want to get our message across in such a way that allows people that freedom of choice? This is kind of our first ethical procedure is how do we give this idea of freedom of choice without putting something up, buy this or not. It's totally up to you, which I mean, perfectly valid big idea if you wanted to, but it is something that when we talk about influencing and when we talk about how we utilize persuasion, we have to consider this idea that people like that freedom of choice. They like the fact that they can understand that they have a say in the matter. So I can give this message and say, hey, you might really need something, and this is something that might benefit you. I'm giving you something that you might enjoy. And how much agency does the audience have in that case? This was kind of cool. I've mentioned this as another author that I really like reading is David Meerman Scott, but this has also come up in some consulting talks that I've been in as of recently about the creative process and why people are drawn to certain things. Um, so first and foremost, David Meerman Scott put up a pretty interesting topic. He basically says, nobody gives a shit about what you do. They want to know how that, whatever it is that you're doing, benefits them. I'm stopping and pausing to give you a sec to reflect on that. How does it benefit them? Patagonia did a really good job of understanding that by saying, don't buy this jacket, because they were like, only if you really need it. And if you need it, buy it. If you don't. And that's a facet and a strong influence that tells us that that's the freedom of choice. That is the thing that's helping us understand it a little bit better. But it also gives that audience agency and say, what do I need? Because ultimately it is a decision for what your audience needs or wants or finds useful. The other axiom, if you will, that I got over the years is people want to feel a part of the creative process. So I help with a consulting firm that looks into um, streaming, and we're talking to a lot of streamers that do their job extremely well. And one of the first things that came up was my audience doesn't my audience doesn't really care about me per se. I mean, they do, but that's not how it started off. It started off in this capacity of, I like what this person does. It puts some value to me. I feel like I have agency. I feel like I have some control. I feel like what's being said, it fills kind of a void of something that I find entertaining. And if that person can fill that, if that person can bring into this like joy in that person's life, then they'll keep coming back. And eventually what it is establishing this relationship with a streamer that they felt like they were very much in tune, and to where they felt like there was a real friendship there. And so these are areas of understanding how persuasion works in advertising, is making sure that the person feels useful, and making sure that their opinions are useful to their product. One of the best things that I can see, this is kind of a dumb example, but I have to say this. I've been a big fan of watching. It's a YouTube channel that last week tonight just started sponsoring, which is kind of cool. But for like the past 3 years, when sports kind of were dormant in the summer because I don't like watching midseason baseball all that much, um, I tune into Yeles Marble Runs. I don't know if you've ever seen this YouTube channel. It's actually really well done and really informed and so forth. One of my favorite things to look at is I look at comments within YouTube, and one of my favorite things to look at within Yeles is people will sit there and say, hey, I complained about something, or I thought something could be improved, and you did it. So like one of them, they would say, hey, this camera isn't working because the marbles are going by too fast in the race that we're trying to do. And so nobody can see the victor as they're going down. We have to do like slow motion to find out who it is. And they're like, that's frustrating. And so Yellis is like, we understand that, we're going to change that. And that gives that audience some agency, and that gives that freedom, if you will. So again, this is a very important aspect within the idea of ethics in advertising, is how much agency, how much freedom does a person have. So anyway, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to start repeating myself. I could go on and on all about this. I do enjoy talking about this, especially when it comes to freedom of will, when we talk about these kind of things. But again, I don't want to take too much of your time. So Monday, we're going to talk a little bit more about Cialdini's processes, as well as get into some philosophers and how this deals with ethics from their perspective. So stay tuned for that. Um, just make sure to go in the forum for this week, and then for next week, we'll make sure that everything's set in stone and ready to go for homework, as well as case studies and so forth. So anyway, you all have a wonderful weekend. Happy 4th of July. And I will talk with you all next week. Thanks. Bye.